You might take your Bibles and turn to Psalm 127, the 127th Psalm. We will start there in just a moment. That's where we will draw our lesson from. It is a privilege to be here this morning. We have several visitors here with us. We are very thankful for your spiritual interest, your desire to meet with God's people. And we hope that the time that we spend together and the way in which we engage in the worship is an encouragement to you. And if there's anything that we do or say that leaves you with questions, if we're not clear about things, I know that sometimes when I get started talking, I just assume we're all on the same page, and that may not be the real way it is. So if I ever say anything that is unclear or unhelpful, then please be willing to talk to me about that, and I'll try to make it as clear as I can. Let me also say I appreciate Brother Lonnie for switching out with me. It's bad for you because you have to hear me 2 weeks in a row. But it will be a blessing because you'll get to hear him a couple of weeks in a row instead of having to listen to me. I think maybe it's not. Maybe we just go right back. I don't know. You're probably the worse off for this, having to hear me twice. But I start my medication tonight, and so I wasn't sure the kind of mindset I'd be in over the week to be able to prepare. And so I appreciate him being willing to swap out. So in the 127th Psalm, and I'm reading from a translation called the Legacy Standard, which where your text may say the Lord, mine says Yahweh, gives us the proper name for God, so don't let that be confusing to you. Psalm 127, a song of ascents of Solomon. Verse 1. Unless Yahweh builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless Yahweh watches the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. It is vain that you rise up early, that you sit out late, O you who eat the bread of painful labors, for in this manner he gives sleep to his beloved. Behold, children are an inheritance of Yahweh. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with enemies in the gate. The 127th Psalm starts out thinking about building a home. And also there's a mention of building a city, but we're going to focus on the home part because of the way that the Psalm finishes up. And when he thinks about building a home, he says how impossible, useless, empty, vain it is to build a home. It's impossible to do so effectively unless that building is done by the Lord. Well, how is a building built by the Lord? Well, it is built by a family that relies on him for the way to build that home. It is by depending on his will and his instruction and trust in him and faithfulness to him all along the way. So how does the Lord build a home? He guides the folks who are building. Men who lead with love, and women who respect and love, and parents who train and teach, and children who listen and obey. If we're not taking the Lord's will into account, and I think this is Solomon's point here in verse 2, if we don't take the Lord's will into account, we can get up early and we can stay up late. And we can be busy all day long, and we can be anxious, and we can work with tireless diligence. But if we don't take his will into account, we will not produce what we really want. We won't produce well-built homes. And you might say, well, I get up early and I stay up late and I make plenty of money and I'm doing just fine. And I think what Solomon would say is, at least at this moment, he would say, but are you building the kind of home that's worth something? Are you building the kind of home that's not just a house, but is something that will be useful in the Lord's cause? I think it is interesting, and it kind of shook me when I first realized this as I was preparing for this, that this is a psalm of Solomon. About a well-built home and about wise sons and children being a blessing. You know, we only read, as far as I know, we only read of one son of Solomon. He was not a wise one. Even though you see this whole book of the book of Proverbs that's almost completely directed towards a son listening to his father and living a wise way. But let me say that when we read of Solomon's son and we see the bad way that he turns out, I think we would say that even though Solomon writes things like this, And even though he writes things like the book of Proverbs, he was not a wise home builder. In fact, we even read in Ecclesiastes 2 how Solomon did devote himself to exactly the vain kind of building. Now, maybe, I think in the text, we kind of get this idea that he was like, well, I'm just going to try this out and see if it works. But I think what he's giving us is a real account of how he decided he was going to live his life. I think he said, I'm going to find meaning in life, and I'm going to do it by working, and by gaining wisdom, and by getting wives, and by getting drunk with wine, and by building these wonderful works. He got up early, I'm sure. He stayed up late, and he worried a lot about all of it. And it was not a well-built home. It was all, what does he say? Vanity. Emptiness. Like a mist. Because he says, what am I leaving behind? Then what? And when I think about the kind of home builder he was, I think about the fact he does build the house of the Lord, the temple. But then when it comes to building his own house, he starts raising up houses for his wives, 1,000 of them. So it's odd that we only read about one son, but I don't think that's a good testimony to the other children if we only read about one, and that's the one we get. And then you see that he builds all of these houses for their gods as well. And he lets his heart be drawn and pulled away by these wives. And so when you think about Solomon as he writes Psalm 127, we see a very noble, high standard for building a house. And even the man who was inspired to write it built vainly. Built in a way that wasn't much profit at the end. But there's a concept in this psalm that I want to talk about today. And it's that idea of children being arrows in the hand of a warrior. When I think about children as arrows, I think what's being communicated is that they are people who, if well directed, can reach further and for longer than we can as parents. My route, my life will end. And that's true for everybody in here unless the Lord returns before that happens. But my route, my life, is probably going to end a long time before I thought it was going to. Now, maybe not. I don't know. But the way things look is that it will end a long time before I thought it was going to. I had high hopes for the next things that I was going to accomplish. I don't know, over the next 150 years. That's what I thought I had. But over the next 50 years in life, I had all of these visions and plans for what I was going to try to accomplish and the places I was going to preach and the books I was going to write. And well, what if it's not 50 years? I do my best now not to presume a day. But what if it's 10 or 15 or 20 years that I have left overall? What if I'm shortened from the 70 or 80 year life that we would like to have? Let me tell you, I am blessed to have a quiver full of arrows. All of us have an end of our course. And I think for almost everybody, it comes before they thought it was going to. There are a few people where they get to a point and they say, all right, that's enough. I'm ready. But almost everybody, it is a course that ends before they think it's going to. All of us are limited in time and opportunity. But I want you to think about this. If I can sharpen, if I can aim, if I can launch 4 arrows in the direction that they need to go, consider how much more I will have accomplished than if I live another 100 years. If I can send 4 arrows in different geographical directions with longer lives to live than I will ever have, Lord willing. Think about the number of people that the 4 of them will come in contact with that I will never meet. Think about the years that they will have, even beyond a long lifetime of mine. Think about the fact that if they are well-launched arrows, they'll be launching arrows too. And you begin to see how well-trained, directed children can make our influence last for generations. Despite the difficulty that I'm facing, it seems like, and I hope to, have about the same amount of time to spend shooting arrows. Right? So there's lots of prognostications and guesses, and nobody knows for sure. But let's say I have 15 years. It's getting pretty close to as long as people who live to be 80 have to spend shooting arrows. Right? I mean, you have 18, 21 years. In 15 years, my older boys will be 22. I was almost married by then. Almost settled down in all of those ways. So despite the difficulty that I'm facing, I'm aware I might not have 20 years. I know. But the beauty that has come out of all of these ashes that I've had to deal with is that it has made me more serious about using what little time I'm going to have. Teaching lessons that I thought, well, I'll be able to teach that for a long time. They'll get it eventually. They may not. I've got to create lessons now. So I realize that they will certainly be the greatest way for me to accomplish good work. If I want to be an influence, if I want to be a light to the world, the most significant way that I will be able to accomplish that is by shooting 4 arrows. I'm limited. My capacity is limited. My time will be limited no matter what. People keep saying, they're growing up too fast. Just listen to people talk about Lena. She's getting so big so fast. She needs to slow down. Nope. Not from my perspective. I know this is a weird perspective. My perspective is as fast as possible. Let's get these kids growing. Now, as the arrow shooter, that means I can't miss a moment. Right? I can't waste any time. But let me tell you this. If you're a parent, it don't matter if you got a brain tumor or not. The time goes fast, doesn't it? It just blinks by, seemingly. And so you don't have time to waste either. You don't have a moment to waste in trying to shoot arrows. Consider I better make the best of my time. Can I give you an example of an arrow launcher? So I was going to use my own family, but I thought that would be very self-promoting since I'm one of the arrows. So I'm not going to do it. But let me give you an example that most of you will know, and if you don't, you could see the effects of his arrow launching just by, well, looking around this room. I think about Brother Ed and Sister Patsy Bradley. And they shot 4 arrows at Brother Eddie, Sister Vicky, Brother Martin, and Brother Jonathan. You may not know all of them, but they are arrows, mostly across the state of Alabama, who had been shot. Right? They married godly people. They were good influences. Brother Eddie was a gospel preacher. Sister Vicky helps take care of the children's camp that is done, and so much more. That's just the thing that you might be most noted for. Brother Martin works with churches in Birmingham. Jonathan became the preacher at Vinemont in Coleman County just recently. And they all are married to godly people. Were married to godly people in certain cases. And some of their arrows. Brother Eddie had 2 arrows. He had Laura, married to a gospel preacher. She's a good Bible student. Matt McDuffie preaches. And he shot Catherine as an arrow, along with Miss Bradley. She taught the ladies' Bible class. She teaches my children sometimes in the back class. So Brother Ed and Sister Patsy are gone. Brother Eddie's gone. But their arrows are still piercing. And then Sister Vicky, she shot some arrows. Stephen Russell, who you've heard preach before probably, is one of the great mentors of mine. I call him regularly for questions and problems that I'm facing. He married a godly woman. I know her arrow launchers too. And then they had a daughter named Summer. Miss Vicky had a daughter named Summer, who married Seth Malden, who's a faithful gospel preacher in Tuscaloosa. I know his arrow launchers too. And then they had another son named Nathan, who married a woman named Erin, and he's not a gospel preacher, but he's a faithful servant, as far as I know. And they have shot arrows, not just by having children of their own biologically, but they've adopted several arrows. And they are, I think, some of the greatest advocates for that kind of work. That's not to mention Stephen has adopted and cares for foster children and things like that. And that doesn't even get, sorry, I just kicked the microphone line. That doesn't even get to the arrows that generation is launching. And I know some of them, and they're pretty sharp. So Brother Ed Bragwell and my grandfather were about the same age, preached in Birmingham at about the same time. And they've launched their arrows. Brother Ed launched his arrows, Sister Patsy did. And still, here we are, removed from passing. The arrows are still piercing, and they're still shooting more arrows, and on and on and on. You see how effective being a good arrow shooter can be? His influence is expanding exponentially, even without him being here. A patriarch, a matriarch may be gone, but their arrows are still flying and piercing. Now, I want you to consider all the arrows we've got sitting in our building this morning. Little arrows, bigger arrows. And I suppose, given the youth of some of our families, that we might add arrows to our congregational quiver, if we can. And whether you want them to or not, people are going to comment on how quickly they're getting big, because it goes fast. Can we all consider for a little while the tremendous power of having a dozen arrows or more to launch into the world? Wherever they go, if they stay here in Franklin County or if they go somewhere else, the power of having arrows to launch as a local group and as parents who are raising those children. Consider that as parents and grandparents, as we continue our work and their sons and daughters go and do their work, that our efforts are not just multiplied, they are exponential. And so, it's easy to see why the psalmist would say, blessed is the man who has his quiver full of them. This is not some command. It's not some demand. And I think there's certainly the recognition in Scripture of people who are not in a position to be able to accomplish such a thing. But it's like having wealth. It's not a demand. But boy, what a blessing it is if it's used well. Now, if it's not used well, I don't know that we would see it as a blessing. I don't. I see it as a tragedy in so many ways. But when you see the way these children are described, they're described as a heritage, an inheritance, as a blessing, as a reward. They are described in chapter 128 in verse 3, Psalm 128 in verse 3. They are described as olive plants all around your table. That doesn't sound like a blessing to me, having olive plants on them. But the oil that comes from the olives, that would be, it's not like grain that's necessary. Olive oil was something that was considered a treasure. It was something that was considered an add-on. Enriching, make life happier and full. They would have no shame with their enemies at the gate. I hope that my boys end up being big, strong men, so that when enemies come to my house, I can say, it's not just me. I got 3 boys with me. And Lena, who will yell at you. She screams now. So, that's what it is like to have children. That you don't have to face challenges and difficulties all on your own. I look at my grandfather and my grandmother, and as they got in their old age and they got sick, you know what my aunts and my dad did? They cared for them in their old age just as they had been cared for in their little age. They faced enemies, but they didn't face them alone. They had shot arrows so that they didn't have to fear the enemies that were at the gate, literally or figuratively. And I think all of this idea of them being a heritage, a reward, a blessing, there is so much talk about children being roadblocks, about children being barriers, about children being bumps in the road because it keeps us from pursuing our career or our dreams. And it doesn't do that if we think about it rightly. It is the greatest treasure if we shoot them well. Now, all of this, I think, helps us to think of the gift of our children from God and to think of this as a call to be faithful stewards. Collier used that phrase in his prayer. That is the idea here. We are entrusted with arrows from the Lord to shoot well. They have been entrusted to our hands. How are we going to manage them? It's the same as if we were given wealth or a home or time or opportunities. They're not ours. They're His. How are we going to manage it? How are we've been entrusted with this. What are we going to do? Of course, I can't say everything about what that looks like from day to day. But what I want, and this has helped me over the last several months as I've just been meditating on this, it's helped me, just that concept of I'm trying to shoot arrows. It's helped me to make decisions as a dad about what I'm going to do. How are we going to spend our time? What are the words I'm going to say in this moment? I'm trying to shoot an arrow. Right? I'm not just trying to get through the moment. I'm not just trying to get them out of the house. I'm trying to launch them for God's purposes. And if we can write that on our hearts as parents and grandparents, and as people who have influence on little children, if we can write that on our hearts, then it will help us make decisions as we go. These arrows, first of all, they need direction and they need discipline. I think that most parents only think in day-to-day terms. I don't know that most parents have any direction that they're sending their children in. I think what happens is they get up in the morning, they get them ready for school because that's what kids do. And then they get them back from school and they let kids play video games because that's what kids do. And then they get them ready for bed because that's what you're supposed to do. And then they get up the next morning and send them to school because that's what kids do. And maybe they go play a ball game because that's what kids do. And it's no thinking about any direction. It's just like, we'll just take it as it comes. They don't have any purpose. They don't have any goals they're trying to accomplish. Some people, I think of their children as such a burden that they try to offload that responsibility in as many ways as possible. I think that's why social media and video games and television become such a problem, is it's because they're not used just as a moment of entertainment. They are literally used to encapsulate the children, to enrapture them, so the parents can be busy about whatever else they're doing. And there are a lot of parents who have a direction for their children. But I'll tell you, as a public school teacher, I'll tell you what those directions are. They are either academics or they are athletics. Those are the directions that people have for their children. And they think this is going to be their way. This is how I'm going to get my success. It's by their success in academics or athletics. Now, it could be music or it could be money more specifically. But I'll tell you, there are a lot of parents who are very serious parents who have a lot of attention paid to their children. But what direction are they sending them? Almost always it's academics and athletics. But if we're thinking about our work as parents, we have greater goals for our children. I have a higher target that I'm shooting for. What we want are children who are a light to the world and who are tools for the Lord's work. When Joshua stood before the people, in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 15, he said, you choose this day whom you will serve. If you're going to serve the gods on the far side of the Mesopotamian rivers, okay. If you're going to choose the ones that are stood out in Egypt or the ones in whose land you now dwell in. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's the determined direction of our arrows. That ought to be. That's what guides our aim. That's the direction we're shooting them. Our goal is that we want arrows that serve the Lord. So I don't want that to diminish our earthly appreciation. Well, maybe I do want it to diminish our earthly appreciation a little bit for academics. I want my kids to make A's in their classes. I want them to do their homework. I want them to be respectful of their teachers. But if they're not academic champions, okay. I like it when they play ball. It's entertaining for me to watch how they have inherited my genes in that, which is just laughable. Okay, so poor guys. I don't know about Lena yet. Maybe she inherited Lydia's genes on that, but I don't know. But if they are not very good, that's all right. I don't know if I've ever told you this. My grandfather, my dad was a really good football player. Probably could have played smaller division football. My grandparents wouldn't let him. They said, if you go play football, basically you're all on your own. And even if you play football at the time, you still needed help in day-to-day. Now you can just sign $1 million contract and buy a Lamborghini. He would have been fine. But anyway, now, I don't know that he would have been that kind of player. But my grandfather came to one of his football games. One. He led the opening prayer and went home. Now, maybe you would say, I would never do that to my son. I would never do that to my grandson. Okay. But you know what my dad learned? My papa had much higher priorities. Much higher priorities than being at the ball game. And so I'm not saying dismiss your children's academic achievements. I'm not saying dismiss their athletic goals. That's fine. But we got higher targets we're shooting for, folks. We're trying to accomplish great purposes. And so fathers are encouraged to bring up their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I'm just always so thoughtful. I'm impressed and I'm encouraged by the example of Eunice and Lois shooting an arrow. Eunice and Lois would have been limited in their opportunities in some ways. But they shot Timothy like an arrow. And he is able to be extremely influential in the world in which he lived and is able to influence us as we have those letters that are written to him. And how does that happen? How do we do that? Well, look at how they did it. This is 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. He says that from your youth, you continue in the things that you have learned and become convinced of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the sacred writings which are able to make you wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. The way that happened is they didn't waste any time. When he was a little boy, they were teaching him the sacred scriptures. And they modeled that, he says, in chapter 1 and verse 5 of 2 Timothy, because he talks about the unhypocritical or the sincere faith that first dwelt in his mother and his grandmother that he was able to see. How do we do this? How do we shoot our arrows with direction and with discipline? We do it as Abe read for us in Deuteronomy chapter 6. By talking about it all the time. By saturating their lives with godly, faithful, biblical principles. We want training. We want consistency. We want high expectations. We want clear explanations. I just want you to think about this. If your aim is to create a great ball player, what do? I have a next door neighbor teacher friend. I think he's a good guy, and I actually think he's in a moment of spiritual seeking right now. We've been able to have multiple conversations that I haven't been able to have with him over the last couple of years. And this week, I've had at least 2 different times where I've talked to him about spiritual things that he's raising the questions. I love it. It's a great opportunity. But you know what he and his boy do every single day? They play catch, and they soft toss every single day. They don't miss a day. And his son, right now, just a little older than mine, great ball player. That's the direction he has for it. So if your aim is to create a great ball player, you're going to do drills, and you're going to show them examples and models of what you want them to be, and you're going to have conversations about that, and you're going to create settings in which they get great joy out of it, and they have a lot of fun being involved in that, and you're going to make sure that they are on good teams, and they have good associations and all of that, and that those are their friends. It's not the bums out there who won't play any baseball, but the ones who will really, they're going to devote themselves to it. That's the kind of guys you want him hanging out with, and you want to make sure we're participating, we're signing up for the leagues, and we're making sure that when he does well, I'm going to praise him about that. And when he doesn't do great, but he tried hard, I'm going to encourage him and say, look, mistakes happen, but we can overcome those. And then when he's not doing what he's supposed to, when he's not meeting my expectations, when he's not even trying, I'm going to correct him. And I'm going to say, look, that's not what we want. If your aim is academics, it's the same process, right? Every night we're going to practice. I'm going to give them models of people who have been successful in academics. We're going to have conversations about that. What did we learn today? We're going to emphasize it. Look at the life you can have if you will devote yourself here. Look at what a college degree will give you, or look at what training in this department will give you. Here are my standards. This is what I expect. And you will praise them when they do well in that. You will encourage them when they're trying but they can't get it. And you say, don't give up, don't quit. And you will correct them when their priorities have gotten out of line. Right? We know how to shoot arrows. But what if you want to shoot them in a spiritual direction? What if you want to launch them in the Lord's work? I don't know. Show up here at 9:30. That's a good start. Regular training, practice, drills. Oh, but that makes it so routine. Yeah, it does in baseball too. Makes it where it just comes easy. Exactly. That's what I want. I want to do singing practice and reading practice and prayer practice and memory practice. And I want to do service practice. I want to put examples and models before them of people who are living faithful lives in challenging circumstances, in circumstances like ours. I want them to have associations of people who are committed to that. I want to tie them into those groups. I want to be participating in the activities. When we have men's work day, as the boys get older, I want them to be participating in that. Right? And when we have Bible classes, when we have special classes, I want my family to be as involved as they can be. I want my goals and emphasizing the importance of it to be a constant topic of my conversation. I want to find enjoyable outlets. If they enjoy singing, I want to find the singings. When we have vacation Bible schools, it's more directed towards their attention and the way that they like to learn things. I want to do that. When it's time to spend time with people who are their age, I want to do that. I want to find enjoyable outlets. I want to set my standards and have conversations. And when they do well, I want to praise them. And when they do well and they fail and they are brokenhearted about that, I want to encourage them. And when they're not meeting the standard, buddy, I want to correct them. So we have this goal that we can call discipline. And I don't want to think about discipline just as the correction, though we'll talk about that, but I want to think about the discipline as the training. In Hebrews chapter 12, I think that's the idea of the discipline there, where the Lord says, this is in Hebrews 12 and verse 5, have you forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he flogs every son whom he receives. For it is discipline that you endure, and God deals with you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which you have all become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our benefit, so that we may share his holiness. And all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. But to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Now, I understand that the point that the Hebrew writer is making is that God's discipline is better than parental discipline. But how does he illustrate it? He says, you know what it's like to be trained. You know what it's like. And I think he's talking both about the discipline, the training that goes along the way, and I think he's talking about the correction that comes when we don't do right. And it's never pleasant in the moment. But it's for eternal good. But there's also correction involved, and we can read the Proverbs about that. But these arrows, they need direction and they need discipline. And maybe as parents, it's more our job on the direction thing and on the discipline part. Let me also make mention that the arrows need demonstration. These are a special type of arrow. and they are affected in their flight pattern by the flight pattern of the arrow before them. And that's us. That's their parents. When I think about a pattern of shooting a faithful arrow and accomplishing great good, I think about Moses' parents that are mentioned in Hebrews 11. To what ability did they have to produce much difference in the status of the people of Israel? Doesn't look like much, but they shot an arrow. And I love this. This is in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Look at that bravery, the courage, and the faith by which Moses' parents lived. Look at verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, regarding the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he is looking to the reward. By faith he led Egypt, not fearing the rage of the king. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like mom and dad, doesn't it? For he endured as seeing him who is unseen. His life of faith without fear, even of earthly consequences, looking to the reward, was shaped by Moses' mom and dad. Now, did they lead the people out of Egypt? Were they the ones that God entrusted with giving the law to the people? Were they the ones that led the people through the wilderness and commissioned that new generation right before they go into the land? They didn't do any of that, except they helped shoot the arrow. And they did so by their demonstration. I think we see that in Eunice and Lois, as Paul makes mention of their sincere faith that dwelt first in them. And then also in Deuteronomy 6, where he says, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then he says, you teach this to your children. It doesn't happen until you've made the commitment first. So what do I want my children to be? I want to be hard workers. And I want them to be faithful spouses. And I want to be helpful local church members. And I want to be generous givers. And I want them to be good Bible students. And I want them to be grateful endurers. And I want them to be arrow shooters. Well, how much am I involved in those things? And how much am I opening the book and involving them in the conversations about what I'm trying to accomplish so that they see in me what I want them to do? Now, godly people raise children, and sometimes the arrows don't go in the direction that they shot them, that they thought that they were shooting. And of course, we all make mistakes along the way. It's impossible to avoid. But even with parents who are raising their children with a general tendency towards godly things, some children don't follow in the directions that their parents give. That's on one side. On the other side is some of the greatest influences in my life didn't have good archers, didn't have good arrow shooters. And yet here you are influencing, shaping me, and the people who shot you, maybe they had different directions in mind, or maybe they had no direction at all. So what I want to say is that the challenge, and at the same time, the beauty of these arrows is that these arrows have to make a decision. There are several young folks. I'm looking maybe back in this back corner. Young folks who are right on the brink of leaving home. You're right on the brink of decisions that you are about to make that are going to shape your direction. They're going to shape the kind of arrow you are. And your parents have been aiming you and sharpening you and guiding you for 15, 16, 17, 18 years. And here you are. And as a parent, I will say the horrific challenge of that. And as an arrow, I would say the beauty of that is that you get to decide which direction you're going to fly. You get to decide what target you're aiming at. Your parents have been guiding you. But the question is what kind of arrow are all of us going to be? We all have to make that decision. Day after day after day. Now maybe you say, well, you think you know the instruction and you think you know the example that my parents have given me. But let me tell you about it. They're not all that they should be. No, they're not. No offense. Neither am I. Neither is any parent out there. They're not all that they should be. But you're an arrow that gets to make a decision about which direction you're going to fly. And I see a lot of children leave homes where their parents tried to guide them in godly instruction, and because of some bitterness or because of some animosity, they refuse to fly in the right direction because they say, well, you don't know what my parents put me through. No, I don't. But I know you can still serve the Lord. And you can do better than them in launching the arrows that you're going to launch. Or you can make a wreck of this whole thing. Those are the options that are before you. I don't say that, any of that, to minimize the role parents have in pointing children in the right direction. I say all that to encourage every one of us. We are all arrows for the Lord's cause, if we will be, if we will decide in that direction. Arrows in the hands of a warrior. What direction are you headed? What's the target that you're aiming at? For those of you who have influence over younger children, what direction are you sending them in? What target are they aiming at? And how does our discipline and our direction and our demonstration bring them to the decision that they need? This is supposed to be a lesson of encouragement. An encouragement to say, let's do the work that God has entrusted us with. Let's be good stewards of these great treasures that have been entrusted to us. As parents, as Bible class teachers, as local church members, let's embrace the beauty and the challenge that's before us. Amen. If we can encourage you in any spiritual way, we want to. Won't you come while we stand?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.